The ambiguity surrounding Edward II's demise allows each era to reinterpret his story through the lens of its own ideologies and political motivations, turning his fate into a kind of historical inkblot test that reflects more about the storytellers than the actual events. Writers of the medieval period cited it to legitimize Edward III's rise. Those from the Reformation era used it as a critique of papal involvement in English governance. Contemporary scholars continue to examine it as an issue of conflicting sources and historical bias. One fact remains indisputable. The death of Edward II brought a close to one of England's most sorrowful and revealing monarchies. His downfall stands as a stark lesson that, in the medieval era, both personal shortcomings and political missteps could lead to consequences of extraordinary savagery. Regardless of whether he succumbed to illness, was slain in a more traditional manner, or endured the gruesome end detailed by period chroniclers, his passing epitomized the ultimate cost of failing to meet the demands of kingship. In a world where authority was deeply personal, unquestioned, and merciless. Perhaps the most lasting insight from Edward II's fate is that the narratives we craft around historical events can be more enduring than the facts themselves. The tales of his harrowing end, authentic or invented, fulfilled vital roles for the tellers, reinforcing warnings against ineffectual leadership, underscoring expectations of royal conduct, and validating the political shifts that followed. In this way, the account of his death gained a potency beyond the actual event, influencing English political imagination well past the confines of Berkeley Castle and the short, troubled reign of a failed sovereign. Even today, nearly 700 years after that fateful September evening in 1327, we continue to wrestle with the ethical dilemmas his story presents. How far is too far in challenging authority? What boundaries exist for justified rebellion? When does reform cross the line into cruelty? These timeless dilemmas, as poignant now as in the 14th century, ensure that the shadow of Edward II's end still lingers, serving not only as a historical case study, but also as a haunting reminder of the dangers that come when power is misused or violently contested. In early 14th century England, society operated under strict hierarchies and unyielding standards for royal conduct. Monarchs were expected to serve first and foremost as warriors, leading troops into battle and expanding dominions through military conquest. They were also expected to be devout Christians, faithful spouses, and fathers who could ensure a secure line of succession. Personal affiliations, especially those viewed as inappropriate or politically harmful, were expected to be set aside in favor of the greater interests of the crown and the realm. Edward II faced challenges from the moment he assumed the throne in 1307. In stark contrast to his father, who had gained admiration through battlefield triumphs and strong leadership, Edward showed more interest in private companionship and leisurely pursuits than in the burdens of kingship. His close association with a Gascon knight named Piers Gaveston stirred immediate controversy, not solely due to its intensity, but because Edward bestowed upon Gaveston significant authority and privileges, provoking outrage among the traditional aristocracy. The fragile political system of medieval England rested on a careful equilibrium between the king's power and noble influence. Leading barons, expected to play key roles in governance, receive high offices and share in royal rewards. By instead showering Gaveston, a foreigner of relatively low birth with titles, land, and the king's open affection, Edward disrupted this essential balance. He granted Gaveston the distinguished title of Earl of Cornwall, one of the kingdom's most revered honors, along with extensive holdings and unparalleled royal favor. The controversy was further inflamed by the nature of their personal connection. Chroniclers of the era often writing with disdain for Edward, portrayed the bond in ways that unsettled many of their contemporaries. Whether their relationship was romantic, as some modern scholars argue, or an extraordinarily deep friendship, it contravened conventional ideals of royal comportment. During a time when royal marriages were expected to serve as diplomatic arrangements and personal feelings were to be sacrificed for statecraft, Edward's overt attachment to Gaveston was seen as a perilous flaw, one that jeopardized the kingdom's stability. Matters worsened when Edward's military ventures began to collapse. His father had left unresolved tensions in Scotland, where Robert the Bruce was battling for independence. Rather than securing quick and decisive victories to reassert English dominance, Edward endured a string of humiliating defeats. The worst was the catastrophic loss at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, where a much smaller Scottish army decimated the English forces, captured high-ranking nobles, and delivered a blow to England's pride, from which Edward's reputation never recovered. Bannockburn represented more than a simple loss on the battlefield. It was a profound failure of royal leadership that laid bare Edward's inadequacies as a king expected to lead in war. In medieval times, a monarch's presence and ability to inspire were considered just as vital as strategy and manpower. A monarch who failed to lead his armies to victory, who appeared hesitant or feeble in the face of conflict, lost not only wars, but also the sacred aura of royal authority. To Edward's barons, he no longer resembled a divinely sanctioned sovereign, but rather a hindrance to England's prosperity and defense. In the wake of Bannockburn, organized resistance among the nobility began to coalesce, headed by his cousin, Thomas of Lancaster. A coalition of influential lords started enforcing strict limitations on the king's power. They insisted on having the authority to approve key appointments, oversee royal spending, and effectively strip Edward of meaningful control, turning him into little more than a ceremonial figure. This wasn't just a political dispute. It was a direct challenge to Edward II's legitimacy as ruler. Tensions further escalated following his 1308 marriage to Isabella of France. Though the union had been arranged to bolster Anglo-French relations, it began on a hopeful note. Isabella possessed intelligence, charm, and shrewd political instincts, traits that could have helped steady Edward's increasingly shaky rule. She bore him 4 children, including the future Edward III, seemingly fulfilling her role as queen. Yet her position at court grew ever more precarious, as Edward's favoritism towards select male companions continued to dominate palace dynamics. After Piers Gaveston was executed by disgruntled nobles in 1312, Edward developed equally intense bonds with others, most notably Hugh Despenser the Younger. The Despensers, both father and son, eventually eclipsed Gaveston in power and infamy. They effectively commandeered the governance of England through their sway over Edward, enriching themselves through royal favor while stirring deep resentment across the realm. For Isabella, watching her husband pour his attention, wealth, and affection into these relationships, all while disregarding his duties as king and as husband, became intolerable. Isabella was far more than a scorned spouse. She was a monarch's consort whose political authority and personal honor were being systematically dismantled by Edward's conduct. The French court, where she had been raised, grew increasingly dismayed by the developments in England, regarding Edward's misrule as a stain on royal decorum and a slight against their princess. The situation reached its boiling point in the mid-1320s. During a diplomatic trip to France, Isabella made the bold decision not to return to England. Instead, she entered into a very public romantic and strategic alliance with Roger Mortimer, a disgraced English nobleman who had once been imprisoned in the Tower of London, only to escape and find refuge in France. There, Mortimer and Isabella plotted what would soon become one of the most effective coups in royal history. Their bond was both intimate and strategic. Isabella saw in Mortimer the assertive, capable partner she had never found in her husband, while Mortimer viewed her as the key to regaining power and influence in England. Together, they rallied support from discontented nobles, raised an invasion army, and prepared to remove Edward II from the throne by force. The Queen had evolved from a sidelined consort into the driving force behind a rebellion against her own husband. The 1326 invasion unfolded with remarkable speed and impact. Isabella and Mortimer arrived in Suffolk with a relatively small contingent, but Edward's government disintegrated almost immediately. Years of frustration with the Despensers and widespread dissatisfaction with Edward's leadership had eroded nearly all support for the crown. One noble after another pledged allegiance to Isabella, leaving Edward virtually isolated. The Despensers were soon captured and met exceptionally gruesome ends. Hugh Despenser the Younger suffered a notorious execution, hanged, drawn, and quartered after enduring vicious tortures that mirrored the fury his dominance had provoked. Edward fled west, attempting to reach safety in Wales or perhaps Ireland, but he was apprehended near the Welsh frontier in November 1326. Once a dominant figure among European monarchs, Edward now found himself a captive, entirely vulnerable to the very people he had alienated through years of flawed governance. His arrest marked not only the collapse of his rule, but the onset of a calculated effort to erase him not merely as a sovereign, but as a person. Edward II's forced removal from the throne was unprecedented in the annals of English monarchy. Never before had a reigning king been deposed while still alive, and orchestrating the act required complex legal and political choreography to simulate legitimacy. With Isabella and Mortimer now exercising authority in the name of Edward's young heir, the future Edward III, they had to navigate a narrow path between legal appearance and the practical necessity of neutralizing Edward permanently. Parliament convened in January 1327. But the session was heavily influenced. Mortimer's allies held sway over London, and with Edward in confinement, the gathered lords and church officials faced a clear ultimatum: either depose the king or face the repercussions of defying the new leadership. The accusations brought against Edward were scathing: gross incompetence, inability to protect the kingdom, delegating authority to despised favorites, and tarnishing the monarchy's honor. While many of these claims had merit, the entire procedure resembled a carefully managed legal spectacle designed to validate what was, at its core, a successful seizure of power. What distinguished this deposition was its assertion that the action reflected the collective will of the realm. Rather than framing it as a mere aristocratic uprising, Isabella and Mortimer claimed to act on behalf of all of England, the nobility, clergy, and commoners, to remove a king deemed unfit and to install one capable of sound governance. This marked a transformative constitutional moment with enduring influence on English political structure, laying the groundwork for future parliamentary roles in questions of royal succession. Edward's abdication was ultimately secured through a mixture of legal coercion and implicit threats. Envoys were dispatched to Kenilworth Castle, where he was detained, to convey Parliament's verdict and demand his official surrender of the crown. The scene described by chroniclers was pitiable. The once sovereign Edward, now clad in plain black garments, wept as he consented to relinquish the throne to his son. Whether this abdication was freely given or coerced remains a subject of scholarly dispute yet. In practical terms, Edward had no real alternative. The new leadership faced a pressing dilemma. What should be done with the dethroned monarch? Releasing him outright was not an option. He would forever remain a symbol around which discontent could rally. Detaining him indefinitely posed both political risks and logistical burdens. While there were precedents in other realms for managing unwanted former rulers, none provided a clear template for Edward's unique predicament. The strategy ultimately chosen was both calculated and ominous. Edward was transferred from Kenilworth to Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire, ostensibly for reasons of cost and enhanced security. Berkeley belonged to Thomas de Berkeley, a noble whose family had suffered greatly during Edward's reign, a man who could be relied upon to ensure the ex-king remained contained. The selection of Berkeley was deliberate. It was isolated enough to deter any rescue efforts, well fortified to prevent escape, and managed by someone with personal animosity toward Edward II. His confinement there was intentionally severe. The trappings of royal comfort were stripped away. In their place was a cell crafted to crush his morale and deteriorate his health. Psychological torment played as central a role as the physical restraints. Edward was to be deprived not only of power and liberty, but of pride and optimism. Each detail of his existence was meticulously designed to emphasize his disgrace and utter reliance on his jailer's mercy. Contemporary sources suggest that his confinement at Berkeley may have been orchestrated to end his life gradually while maintaining plausible deniability. His cell was reportedly situated above the castle's waste channels, subjecting him to disease-laden air. His meals were sparse and inconsistent, his sleeping arrangements poor, and his treatment deliberately degrading. Had he succumbed to sickness or despair, his wardens could have plausibly claimed they were merely obeying orders without intent to harm. But this slow method of eliminating Edward evidently proved too sluggish for those in charge. By mid-1327, pressure had mounted for a final solution to the Edward problem. Whispers of rescue plots were growing, and international observers, including foreign monarchs, were beginning to raise concerns about the ex-king's well-being. Isabella and Mortimer needed Edward dead, but they needed his demise to appear natural, or at the very least, not blatantly violent. The decision to shift from passive neglect to active assassination marked a pivotal moment in one of medieval England's most grim and controversial episodes. What unfolded next at Berkeley Castle would go on to become one of the most chilling and hotly contested episodes in medieval historical records. A tale so gruesome and heavy with symbolism that many scholars have doubted its authenticity. Yet, available evidence suggests that something truly dreadful happened in that prison cell. An act not merely aimed at removing a political rival, but also meant to serve as a dire warning about the cost of defying medieval ideals of kingship. By the summer of 1327, mounting pressure was being placed on Isabella and Mortimer to deal with Edward II once and for all. Foreign powers, especially the French crown and the Holy Roman Empire, began voicing pointed concerns about the treatment of the former monarch. Even Pope John XXII raised alarms over Edward's well-being. Meanwhile, rumors swirled of attempts being planned to free him from his captivity at Berkeley. More unsettling still were whispers that some English nobles were beginning to regret the deposition, questioning whether removing a divinely anointed king had been a step too far. The political reality, however, was stark. As long as Edward II remained alive, he posed a serious risk to the stability of the new regime. Regardless of his abdication, many still saw him as the rightful king. Since Edward III was still a child, Isabella and Mortimer's hold on power depended entirely on ensuring that Edward II could never return. There was no turning back. Reconciliation was off the table. The success of their rebellion demanded a final, irreversible step. The path they chose reflected the sinister finesse of medieval political assassination, a mix of discretion and symbolism. Edward could not be openly murdered. A stabbing or poisoning would risk making him a martyr and might rally loyalists to his cause. Instead, his death had to appear accidental or natural, while at the same time broadcasting a message of intimidation to potential challengers. Accounts written by medieval chroniclers, many penned years or even decades later, contradict one another on the specifics of what transpired at Berkeley Castle in September 1327. Some claim Edward succumbed to illness or emotional despair under miserable conditions. Others allude to foul play, though without elaboration. However, the most graphic and haunting version tells of a death so atrocious and symbolically charged that it appears calculated to obliterate Edward's legacy and strike fear into the hearts of anyone who might seek to restore him. The most commonly cited narrative describes an execution method that was both savagely effective and steeped in symbolism. In this version, Edward was restrained by his jailers, while a red-hot iron rod was inserted through his anus, searing his internal organs and causing excruciating pain, yet leaving no outward evidence of violence. This method would have enabled Edward's executioners to assert that he had perished from natural causes, all while inflicting a death that was both excruciating and deeply degrading. The symbolic implications of this purported execution technique are impossible to ignore. In the medieval mindset, punishments often mirrored the nature of the alleged offense, and Edward's rumored homosexual affairs with his favorites had shocked and outraged his contemporaries. If these reports are to be believed, his killing was designed as the ultimate insult, a savage rebuke of what his enemies viewed as moral deviance and a failure to fulfill the masculine ideals of kingship. Executing such a plan would have required meticulous coordination and the involvement of several trusted participants. The iron implement had to be heated to the precise intensity, the victim securely restrained, and the deed performed with enough precision to fulfill its objective while leaving behind minimal forensic evidence. This was no impulsive act or emotional outburst. It was a strategic political assassination, crafted as a chilling deterrent to anyone thinking of defying Isabella and Mortimer. The announcement of Edward's death on the 21st of September, 1327, was made with suspicious swiftness to the court in London. The stated cause was a natural passing, brought on by sorrow and ill health. Elaborate burial arrangements were set in motion almost immediately, as a demonstration of the new leadership's supposed respect for royal tradition. Edward's body was displayed to the public before interment, and observers noted no apparent signs of external violence, which, if true, would align with the claims surrounding his covert murder. Reactions to the news of his demise diverged sharply depending on political allegiance. Isabella and Mortimer performed the expected displays of mourning, even as they privately rejoiced in the elimination of their most dangerous opponent. Allies of the previous regime whispered about assassination, but dared not voice accusations openly. The general populace, disillusioned by Edward's rule but still reverent of the monarchy, was left bewildered and uneasy by the rapid chain of events that saw their king dethroned, jailed, and dead, all within a matter of months. What renders the narrative of Edward's death particularly terrifying is not just the cruel nature of the alleged method, but the deliberate precision with which it was orchestrated. This wasn't a desperate or emotional act. It was the cold calculus of power, turned into a theatrical display, meant to annihilate both the man and the very image of him. The symbolism mattered just as much as the physical outcome. It delivered a powerful message: defy the new regime, and the consequences would be not just fatal but unforgettable. The immediate response following Edward II's death further exposed how carefully choreographed the entire affair had been. Within hours, messengers fanned out across the kingdom, informing sheriffs, clergy, and nobles. The sheer speed and organization behind this effort hinted strongly that his death had been expected and strategically timed, rather than the sudden, tragic end portrayed in official statements. Berkeley Castle, meanwhile, was transformed into a tightly controlled and curated crime scene. Thomas de Berkeley, the lord of the castle, promptly distanced himself from any involvement in Edward's demise, asserting that he had been away during the critical time. This conveniently timed absence was almost certainly prearranged, offering Berkeley plausible deniability, while ensuring that a figure of sufficient rank remained to supervise the former king's final hours. Others present at the castle, including guards, attendants, and officials, were either sworn to silence or quietly removed as potential witnesses. Preparing Edward's body for public viewing became another pivotal step in concealing the truth. Although medieval embalming methods were rudimentary, they sufficed to preserve a body long enough to organize the ceremonial aspects of a royal burial. More significantly, the embalming process would destroy much of the internal physical evidence, making it virtually impossible for anyone to verify or dispute claims regarding torture or violent death. The funeral itself was a meticulously staged display of statecraft, designed to project Isabella and Mortimer's image as grieving guardians of the monarchy, while simultaneously asserting their control. Edward's remains were transported from Berkeley to Gloucester Cathedral with solemn ceremony, drawing throngs of spectators who saw no obvious marks of brutality on the corpse. The ornate tomb constructed for him, which remains standing today, presented him as a rightful monarch who had died peacefully, rather than as the victim of a political assassination. But perhaps most revealing was the fate of those most closely tied to Edward's final captivity. In the months following his death, several castle personnel met suspicious ends, a few perishing in odd accidents, others vanishing entirely, and some turning up dead under circumstances suggesting they had known too much. This quiet purge of witnesses marked the final chapter of the cover-up, ensuring that the truth of Edward's fate was buried with those who had seen it unfold. The larger political consequences of Edward's elimination played out exactly as Isabella and Mortimer had envisioned. With the deposed king permanently out of the picture, resistance to the new regime crumbled. Young Edward III was crowned in a formal ceremony, though actual governance remained firmly in the hands of his mother and her consort. For a time, Their authority seemed solid, validated by the removal of an unfit ruler and the installation of a seemingly more competent administration. Yet, the same violence that secured their dominance also planted the seeds of their eventual ruin. The whispered rumors surrounding Edward's death at Berkeley began to spread unease and moral discomfort, gradually corroding the legitimacy of their rule. Many of those who had initially supported the king's ousting started to question whether the revolution had descended into something far darker than they had imagined. The boundary between necessary reform and unforgivable savagery had been breached, leaving the new regime morally tainted and politically vulnerable. The international response to Edward's demise was more subdued than one might have anticipated. This was due, in part, to the relief among many foreign courts at the apparent resolution of England's internal turmoil, and also because the official account that he had died of natural causes was difficult to dispute in the absence of solid evidence. Nonetheless, private letters exchanged between European royal households reveal lingering doubts about the actual circumstances surrounding Edward's death. These suspicions strained England's diplomatic relations for many years thereafter. Most importantly, the young Edward III took significant lessons from his father's downfall that would influence his reign profoundly. As he matured and began to claim his authority, he displayed none of the hesitance or fragility that had marked Edward II's rule. His swift and forceful removal of Isabella and Mortimer in 1330 strongly suggests that he had learned from both the failings of his father and the ruthless strategies employed to remove him. Ironically, the very savagery that brought about Edward II's downfall eventually paved the way for retribution. The question of whether Edward II truly suffered the gruesome fate described in some medieval accounts has long captivated scholars. The evidence remains inconsistent, often colored by political motives, and offers no firm answers. However, certain facts are beyond dispute. Powerful figures wanted Edward removed. He perished under suspicious conditions while under guard, and the official narrative seemed crafted more to shield the perpetrators than to clarify the truth. Some contemporary historians suggest that the entire narrative of a horrific execution may have been a posthumous invention intended to vilify Isabella and Mortimer after they themselves were overthrown. Under this interpretation, Edward may have either died from natural causes or been discreetly assassinated, with the more sensational elements added later to enhance the villainy of his enemies. Indeed, the allegedly symbolic method of his execution, so perfectly aligned with medieval condemnations of sexual misconduct, seems almost too tidy to be entirely authentic. Yet, there is also credible evidence that supports a darker version of events. The systematic silencing of witnesses, the choreographed handling of the king's death and burial, and the clear political advantages gained by Isabella and Mortimer all point to a deliberate and sinister act rather than a natural passing. Moreover, similar forms of covert and brutal executions have been documented in other medieval political contexts, lending weight to the plausibility of these claims, even if the details may have been exaggerated over time. Perhaps the strongest case for the murder hypothesis lies in the political rationale. By the time of Edward's death, Isabella and Mortimer had gone too far to allow any return to the status quo. They had ousted a consecrated monarch, seized the reins of power under the guise of ruling for his underage son, and purged his loyalists through executions and exile. Under such conditions, keeping Edward alive was not only politically perilous, it was an existential threat to their regime. There was no turning back. The method reportedly used to kill Edward, if indeed authentic, reflects a disturbing psychological awareness of medieval attitudes toward power, shame, and symbolic punishment. This was not merely an act of murder, but a deliberate message, a carefully executed demonstration of what happens when societal expectations are defied. Edward's alleged homosexual liaisons had outraged his contemporaries, and his death appears to have been tailored to echo and penalize those perceived transgressions in the most savage way imaginable. What makes this case especially unsettling is the intersection of personal vengeance and political expediency. Isabella's actions were not entirely rooted in political strategy. She had endured personal degradation at the hands of a husband who sidelined her in favor of his male companions. The cruel nature of Edward's purported execution hints at a personal bitterness that surpassed strategic thinking. A revenge fueled by years of humiliation and emotional abandonment by the very man meant to uplift and protect her. Edward II's demise left an imprint that went far beyond the immediate consequences of his removal in 1327. Whether rooted in truth or embellished into legend, his story entered the fabric of English cultural memory, a stark warning about the perils of feeble kingship and the price of transgressing accepted norms. His downfall set a historical precedent for the removal of monarchs that would echo in future constitutional upheavals, most notably during the English Civil War and the execution of Charles I. This narrative also exposes the medieval intersection between sexuality, authority, and legitimacy in governance themes that still provoke discomfort and debate today. Edward's collapse wasn't solely about his inability to govern or command in war. It was his failure to live up to the era's masculine ideals of kingship, and his associations that defied societal conventions. Whether his death was real or a constructed symbol, it became punishment not only for political incompetence, but also for perceived moral and social deviance. For modern readers, Edward II's fate provokes complex reflections on historical truth and the power of political narrative. Was the gruesome tale of his death an accurate account of a savage execution? Or was it a crafted myth designed to exonerate Edward III and vilify Isabella and Mortimer? We may never know the full truth, lost as it is in the tangled web of medieval agendas and myth-making. But what is unmistakable is that Edward II's downfall remains a potent reminder of the brutal consequences of political failure in a time when royal power was unchecked and deeply personal. No matter the exact cause of his end, whether through illness, discreet assassination, or the shocking method described by medieval writers, Edward's death marked the collapse of one of England's most sorrowful reigns and heralded a new chapter in the enduring clash between monarchy and baronial power. The legacy of his downfall cast a long shadow, shaping the evolution of English politics and monarchy for generations to come. The mere possibility that a monarch could be not only dethroned, but also slain in such a cruel and symbolically charged way permanently shifted the dynamic between sovereign and subject. Kings could no longer rely on divine ordination as a safeguard against the ultimate price of political collapse. A precedent had been established that even a consecrated ruler could meet a violent end if he alienated his people deeply enough. Edward III, who rose to power following the forced abdication and subsequent death of his father, took these lessons to heart. His reign became synonymous with military triumph and strong governance, highlighted by significant victories in France and Scotland that helped restore England's international standing and exemplified the kind of martial kingship his father had conspicuously failed to embody. Whether intentionally or not, Edward III's accomplishments served as a direct rejection of his father's legacy, a demonstration that the Plantagenet dynasty could indeed produce capable leaders when forged in the crucible of past failure. The constitutional developments that accompanied Edward II's removal, particularly the involvement of Parliament in dethroning a monarch, and the argument that such actions reflected the will of the realm, laid legal and political foundations that would reverberate throughout English history. It helped entrench the idea that monarchy was conditional upon competent governance, not simply bestowed by divine right, a notion that would later contribute to the rise of constitutional monarchy. Isabella, despite her initial triumph in removing Edward II, would ultimately face consequences of her own. Once Edward III took control of the government, one of his first decisive acts was to have Roger Mortimer arrested and executed, while confining his mother to a dignified but permanent political exile. The charges brought against Mortimer included the alleged murder of Edward II, an indication that even Edward III may have accepted the theory that his father had not died naturally. Edward II's death also sent shockwaves across the continent. Monarchs from other European states observed with unease how swiftly and thoroughly a reigning king could fall once he lost the backing of his aristocracy and his people. The ruthless swiftness with which Edward was removed stood as both a cautionary tale and a strategic case study for foreign courts grappling with domestic unrest. More enduring, however, was how Edward II's demise became embedded in the national psyche, a symbolic narrative warning against weak rule and inappropriate personal entanglements. Regardless of whether the gruesome accounts of his death were historically accurate, they carried significant symbolic weight, reaffirming cultural expectations around kingship, masculinity, and duty. His story became woven into the shared cultural memory of England, helping to shape ideas about governance and legitimate authority for centuries to come. In the end, the uncertainty surrounding Edward's death proved to be just as politically potent as the act itself. The ambiguity surrounding Edward II's demise has allowed successive generations to reinterpret his story through the lens of their own ideologies and political agendas. His fate has become a kind of historical Rorschach test, one that reflects more about the storytellers than the actual events. Chroniclers of the medieval era used the tale to vindicate Edward III's rise. Writers during the Reformation invoked it to condemn the influence of the papacy in English politics. Contemporary historians analyze it through the prisms of evidence, bias, and historiography. One fact, however, remains unchallenged. The death of Edward II marked the conclusion of one of the most tragic and enlightening reigns in the annals of English royalty. His downfall is a stark reminder that, in the medieval world, both personal failings and political missteps could be punished with staggering cruelty, regardless of whether he succumbed to natural causes, was discreetly assassinated, or endured the appalling fate recorded by some chroniclers. His end came to symbolize the harsh price of ineptitude in an era where rulership was deeply personal, uncompromising, and absolute. Perhaps the most enduring lesson of Edward's death lies in how historical truth often becomes secondary to the narratives constructed around it. The gruesome stories of his execution, whether grounded in reality or shaped by political motives, served key functions. They warned of the perils of frail kingship, reaffirmed prevailing standards of royal conduct, and legitimized the authority of those who succeeded him. In that sense, the myth of Edward's death ultimately eclipsed the man himself, becoming a force that helped mold English political identity far beyond the walls of Berkeley Castle or the confines of his troubled reign. Today, almost 700 years after that fateful night in 1327, we continue to wrestle with the dilemmas posed by Edward's fate. How far can legitimate resistance to authority go? When does rebellion cease to be righteous and cross into unforgivable violence? What are the true limits of political transformation? These questions, as pressing now as they were in the 14th century, ensure that Edward II's grim end continues to reverberate. It stands as both a cautionary tale and a profound meditation on the nature of power, its potential, its abuse, and the devastation it can leave in its wake when wielded without restraint.